Welcome to the America 250 PA Start Here, America Did podcast, telling the unique stories that make up the diverse fabric of Pennsylvania.
Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the America 250 PA podcast. I'm your host, Sydney Harris White. July has come and gone, and we have officially passed the United States 250th anniversary day. But at America 250 PA, we know that a celebration this meaningful cannot be confined to just one day. We spent 8 years prepping for this historic milestone, and the celebration is far from over. Throughout the rest of the year, we will continue sharing stories from communities across Pennsylvania right here on the podcast. You can also be on the lookout for even more exciting opportunities to connect with, explore, and celebrate Pennsylvania's extraordinary place in the American story with America 250 PA. Part of that celebration is shining a light on the people and places whose contributions may not always appear in traditional history books. For today's episode, I am thrilled to welcome Cate Barron, former president of PA Media Group. A Lewistown native, Cate has devoted her professional career to impactful journalism and uncovering stories that might otherwise go untold. One of those stories is that of Dorcas Buchanan, an early settler of what would become Mifflin County, whose life on the Pennsylvania frontier spanned the years before, during, and after the Revolutionary War. Cate has taken a deep dive not only into Dorcas's remarkable life, but also into what it meant to live, survive, and build a community on the Pennsylvania frontier during the 1700s. Cate, thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, it's a delight, Sydney. Thank you.
Of course. And before we get into Dorcas Buchanan's life, I know we're really excited to do so. Can you briefly introduce yourself and tell us how this story first came on your radar?
Well, I can blame it all on my younger sister, Jenny Landis, who is head of the Juniata River Valley Tourist Bureau. And last year, Jenny was working up some material for America 250 up in Lewistown, and said, hey, would you do something on Dorcas Buchanan? I really want to do a brochure on her. And of course, Dorcas lit the light bulb. I remember her from grade school where we had a chapter or two on Pennsylvania history. She was considered the founding mother of Lewistown. I remembered that she and her husband, Arthur Buchanan, opened a trading post and tavern in what had been the indigenous village of Ohesson, later to become Lewistown. I knew that she had come from Ireland and had canoed up the Juniata to get there. And that's about all I knew. I do some digging because, of course, I said, sure, I'll do this, Jen. And it turns out that she had an incredible story that has really been untold for the most part, especially in recent years. This is a woman who braved the wilderness of Western Pennsylvania with a very large family. She faced down repeated violence during the French and Indian War, and she was an eyewitness to the Revolution. She had a son who was tragically killed during the span of that war. She also had another son who was a militia leader, and she became a shrewd tradeswoman. She learned both Shawnee and Lenape, which is Delaware dialects, and she also, I like to say that she smashed glass ceilings when they were made out of logs.
I love that. And so paint a little bit of a picture here for us. What was Pennsylvania like back in Dorcas Buchanan's time?
Well, central Pennsylvania was really considered kind of contested territory. The eastern part of the state of the colony was, of course, under British rule. But as you went farther on out to the Ohio River Valley and beyond, that was very much a stronghold for the French. And you had all the indigenous people in between. You got to Pennsylvania, usually you would come over, and in fact, Dorcas emigrated from Ireland, sail over. It was about a 5-week voyage, tended to land in Philadelphia. And Pennsylvania then was really attractive for colonists because, number one, William Penn had established relatively peaceful relations with Native Americans. Number two, he was really espousing religious freedom that they were not seeing all the time in Britain and Ireland. And number three, there was a lot of land, cheap and plentiful. And that was really the driving force. These people had been restricted in Scotland, Ireland, and England. They wanted to come over here and find land, develop land. They were part of a huge immigration. There were thousands of Scots-Irish who came over, and that included Dorcas and her family. She gets to Pennsylvania, marries her first husband, and they settle in Lancaster, which was the second biggest city in this colony outside of Philadelphia at the time. From there, they went to Carlisle. At the time, this was like 1730s, and it was part of a string of strongholds in the frontier. There was Carlisle, there was Chambersburg, there was Shippensburg. Beyond that, you were really going off into the wilds as you went west of the Susquehanna.
And where would you like Dorcas's story to begin today? I know you've done a ton of research and you found probably, more than we can talk about today. But what is important about Dorcas's story that you'd like listeners to hear?
Well, I want to talk a little bit about what an intrepid person she had to have been and what an incredible challenge it was to be part of the frontier movement in America back then. Just stunning, all the challenges that this woman faced. And what I really like about telling her story is her life spanned the 18th century. Again, born in 1711, she lived well into her 90s. She died in 1804. That was at a time when most colonists, they were lucky if they got to 40. So you can tell this woman had a steel backbone. She just was so incredibly brave. And yes, her husbands got her to where she needed to be to get finally to the Lewistown, Mifflin County, Juniata Valley area. But then she's the one who stayed, and she kept coming back to her homestead there, despite an incredible number of challenges, an incredible number of chances when she could have very easily been killed, either in skirmishes during the French and Indian War. She narrowly missed the burning of Fort Granville, which was the fortress in Lewistown that was destroyed by the French Shawnee and Lenape during the war. She really had an incredibly moving life. In fact, I like to quote from her obit, which was really the only strong piece of original source material I had, which talked about how this woman led such an incredibly strong life that was checkered by the hand of fate.
And I'd like to talk about how you've discovered Dorcas. I mean, you're putting together these pieces of history. Like you said, there's not much written primary source material. How have you found these stories from Dorcas's life?
Well, I'll start number one with, of course, I Googled, I admit it, and I looked at everything I could find online. And thank goodness there is such a wealth of history that is open source on the internet that you can start doing a lot of reading. But I also hung out quite a bit. I'm lucky because I just live over in Camp Hill, and it's like 5 minutes to the state library and the archive. So I was over there in that gorgeous building in their genealogy room looking up Dorcas's family. Dorcas was an Armstrong. Born in Armstrong. She married a Holt, and then her second husband was Arthur Buchanan. All three of those families had a lot of ancestors who went to the New World in the 1700s. So there were family genealogies that I could track down. There were also a lot of histories, regional histories written about Pennsylvania, starting in the, I'd say, mid-1800s, and you could pull from there. But the other things I relied on were a lot of family stories. Because she has so many descendants still living in the area, she has a really active life on Facebook with a number of family blogs. There's also a really lovely historical romance that was written about her. I think it's called The Remarkable Dorcas Buchanan, which was really neat and combined a lot of her stories and legends. Because the woman, she just gave birth to so many legends. There's a lot of talk about how she was this fantastic hunter. There's talk about her getting to know both Chief Logan and Chief Kishigaquillis, two prominent indigenous leaders in colonial America. There's a story, in fact, it's kind of an origin story, that she actually didn't emigrate peacefully with her parents and husband. One story says that she was literally spirited away to the colonies because Henry Holt's family didn't like her. They wanted to split up the marriage, and so she was indeed put on a ship and shipped off to Philadelphia. Now, whether that's true or not, I have my raise my eyebrows. But you want to take in all these legends and stories all together.
Yeah. And I'd love to hear your favorite legends and stories of Cate Buchanan. I'm sorry, I said Kate. Dorcas Buchanan.
Yeah. There were a lot of Kates back then, too.
Right.
So, yeah. I think one of my favorite was the hunting stories. There was a guy, and this is worth another podcast. His name was Henry Shoemaker. He was Pennsylvania's first folklorist, and he was also instrumental in founding the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission. This is back, I think, in the 1920s or so. Henry loved to collect stories from all over Pennsylvania. And he was a little bit of a fabulist. He would spin, he romanticized a lot of Pennsylvania history, but he'd heard about Dorcas from just tales passed down through the generations and wrote quite a few articles and lectured on her all around Pennsylvania. You can find stories about this in newspapers from, 1920s, 1930s. And one of his favorite stories was, he said that Dorcas was a champion hunter, but she didn't like to kill with a rifle, which of course she did always have by her side. But what she would do is she'd pick a prey, she'd pick a deer or even an elk, and somehow funnel them into a body of water. Often it was Jack's Creek, a creek in Lewistown, and drown the animal with her bare hands until it was dead. And then that's how she harvested game. And he tells this great story about kids on the bank cheering her on as she did this. Now, again, you have to take it with a grain of salt. Henry told the same story about Dorcas's granddaughter who lived in the McVeytown area. So I don't know. But it's interesting to hear this and try to discern some of the truth between the fiction. I think it's worth looking at it all, but with that caveat, look, decide for yourself. I can give you the facts from original sources, from the few documents we have. I think there are 3 or 4 evidences of her signature on land deeds and things like that. But you have to mix in these tales as well, because that's part of her whole legend.
Right. And why do you think Dorcas's story is not more widely known, maybe even beyond Pennsylvania? Why does this take digging and uncovering?
Well, I think some of it is Arthur, her second husband, who is the guy who got her to Lewistown up a very arduous route. He's the one who has his name on most of the original land deeds. There's some pieces of his writing that are still existing. In Carlisle, I found a document on a tavern license application, because back then you had to be licensed or you would be fined for running a tippling house, which Arthur was several times. In fact, the guy also was in jail over bad debts over the years too. So everybody has these very, interesting past lives. Anyway, so there's much more documentation about Arthur. He also rode with the High Sheriff of Lancaster in Cresap's War, which was a big border dispute between Pennsylvania and Maryland. I think the 40s or so, pretty famous conflict. But there's just more documented history on Arthur. But he gets her to Lewistown, at the time Ohesson. She's there when he's negotiating with the Shawnee and the Delaware for land. She's there helping him bring that tavern up. She's with him every time they had to flee the area because of war party incursions. But then she's the one who decided to come back. But she doesn't write. There's no diary. There's no letters from this woman. It's really been passed on with occasional references, and then the families keeping with that history.
So her husband did not come back? Did she come back on her own?
Yes, her husband. Okay, she marries Arthur in 1738. She was 26. In the meantime, then they have 7 kids. So that brings her number of children. We think she had anywhere between 9 and a dozen children.
And she lived till 90.
Yes. I mean, my gosh, fortitude. Anyway, she marries Arthur in 1738. In 1754, the British negotiated what was known as the Albany Treaty, which released lands west of the Susquehanna River for settlement. So all of a sudden, that happens at the beginning of the summer that year. Arthur, who was such a person to spot opportunity, says, okay, I'm there. He had been, as I mentioned, a fur trader and a merchant in Lancaster and Carlisle. He knew that there were great hunting grounds in the Juniata Valley. So he packs up the family and they head upriver to Ohesson. This, from Carlisle to the Ohesson area, now Lewistown, was a really arduous journey. There were a couple ways to get there. You could go over what was later known as the Granville route, which was a whole bunch of mountain ridges between Carlisle, Sherman's Valley, and then into the Lewistown area. Very tough going, but a lot safer than the normal route, which would be to take the Great Road up from Carlisle to what is now Harris Ferries area, and then down the Susquehanna, down the Juniata. But you had to pass through Long's Narrows, which anybody who's ever driven the road from Harrisburg to State College for games, they go through what's now known as the Juniata Narrows. Very funneling type part of land, which people would line the banks to ambush travelers going down that river stretch because you were really a sitting duck. But they did it. Dorcas is credited with not only being the first European woman to own property in the Lewistown area, but also to be the first to canoe down the Juniata through the Narrows. Anyway, she had all these arduous things that she had to do, but Arthur got her there. Arthur only spent a few months at O'Hesson. This is the thing that amazed me. For some reason, I thought, oh gosh, Arthur Buchanan, founder of Lewistown, he's been there for years. No, he was only there a few months when they kept having to leave during the French and Indian War. War parties led by the French would come in and terrorize the British colonists. And luckily, Arthur, who had, as I said, was a trader, had very good relations with Chief Kishicaquillis of the Shawnee. And the Shawnee, who were relatively neutral during that war, would come and warn the Buchanan family. You'd better leave. There are going to be more war parties coming up. They told the Buchanans to stay away from Fort Granville when that edifice was built the following year because it was going to come under attack. And sure enough, the fort was burned to the ground. People captured or killed. But the Buchanans were back in the safety of Carlisle.
I'd love to hear a little bit more about Dorcas later in her life during the Revolutionary era. Is there any mention of her involvement or stories around her at that point in history?
Oh, yes, I can share a few for sure.
Okay.
Thank you, Sydney. First of all, I will point out that when Arthur died, and this goes back to your former question about why don't we hear about Dorcas? When Arthur dies, the governor of Pennsylvania sends condolences to Arthur's sons. Not a mention of Dorcas. Okay. You draw your own conclusions.
Right.
Anyway, during the Revolution, Dorcas was living in, it had been called Old Town, but now it was going to be called Lewistown going forward. And she was living with her son, Arthur Jr. And there were a number of his siblings were in the area. I think there were 4 or 5 Buchanans that had settled with her. Because this is part of that whole large families that colonized different parts of America. And for sure the Buchanans were there. She was living there, and she had 2 of her sons, at least that we know of, were in the militia, the Pennsylvania militia. And they would be called upon by Washington to go and fight different battles. I know that Arthur Jr. had gone to New Jersey. I think he was in Valley Forge for a while too. Anyway, militia would have practice continually in Lewistown. And one day, her son by Henry, Thomas Holt, was practicing musket fire with his half-brother when his half-brother mistakenly shot and killed Thomas.
Oh.
So this was just a few blocks away from the homestead. Dorcas sees that son die. In the meantime, Arthur Jr. Becomes quite a militia leader, and it brought home, there are some letters existing from him where he's writing to his superiors. And to me, it really captured the revolution in that part of Pennsylvania, because I think most of us think of the revolution as happening, well, it did, and most of the battlefields were well east. But there were still a lot of these war party incursions prompted by the French trying to terrorize the colonists while the revolution was going on. And at one point, Arthur Jr. writes to his superiors and says, no, I will not send more troops eastward to fight those battles. We have to survive ourselves, and we have to protect our settlers. Mm-hmm. Because during the French and Indian War, there was a huge exodus of settlers from western and central Pennsylvania back east to safety. Carlisle was a big refuge for those folks. But the same thing was starting to happen during the Revolution. So even though there was no Battle of Brandywine or anything like that going on in Mifflin County, Juniata County, that whole area, there were ripple effects from the Revolution.
Is there anything that you'd like our listeners to know about Dorcas Buchanan beyond what we've talked about today?
The other thing I do want to mention is, and this is part of the whole legend, but supposedly Chief Logan, a very prominent Mingo leader, as we said, I spent a year at Chief Logan High School, in fact, in Lewistown area. Chief Logan was a good friend of the family. When Dorcas was in her middle age, she went blind.
Oh, my goodness.
I've talked to some optometrists, I've talked to some other people about what could have caused this. It could have been scarlet fever. It could have been one of a number of maladies at that time. She goes blind, loses her vision. Luckily, she's living in her son's home. There are a lot of relatives around, I think, to be her support network back then. But Chief Logan comes to visit her. According to her obit, which is, again, the most wonderful repository for Dorcas first information, Logan walks into their cabin. He clasps her hand and says, "Don't worry, you will have your sight restored and you will live to be a very old woman." I'm sure Dorcas was skeptical, but 23 years later, her sight comes back just as quickly as it's lost. And she did live into her 90s. One more story.
Yeah.
She dies in, I think I said 1804. She's buried in an unmarked grave in what was called Old Town Cemetery. It still exists in Lewistown. 30 years later, two men who were strangers to the area were traveling through, probably came up the turnpike and stopped in Lewistown. They're probably in a tavern and starting to hear stories about Dorcas Buchanan. They were so impressed by her deeds, the hunting, the fleeing, the war parties, just how she came back to keep settling Lewis. She was not deterred by any of the violence and trauma that they'd experienced there. She kept coming back to stay in Lewistown. They climb up nearby Shade Mountain, find a nice piece of sandstone, bring it back, carve a monument for her grave, and put it over the place where she's buried. They misspell her name, which I think is kind of fitting too in a way.
Right.
But it's just that's how we know where she's buried. And you can still go there and see it at Old Town Cemetery. Last spring, I gave a talk about Dorcas in Lewistown. And I have to tell you too, Sydney, I thought, if we get 30 people, that'll be great. And my sister kept saying, no, people are really fascinated by local history. It was standing room only. There were 130 some people in the room and had to turn people away. It wasn't about me. It was all about hearing about Dorcas. And I think that there's such passion for local history, and especially now at America 250. And I was just so buoyed by that. I mean, I've fallen in love with it. I'm far from done with this Dorcas project. I need to research her church records. She was a staunch Presbyterian. And luckily the church I went to as a child, has very good records. We're going to go back and do that. I'm also going to revisit some of the locations during the French and Indian War that made central Pennsylvania and western Pennsylvania so vital, because there's a podcast I heard, and I also have been sucking up information on podcasts and audiobooks. And the historian says most Americans know more about the Peloponnesian Wars than they know about the French and Indian War. That was true for me, but it's fascinating. And it is so much, in some ways, it had almost as much of an impact on the Mifflin County area. And that's an area I love. I'm born and raised there, go back quite often to visit my brother and sister who still live there. Just what a frontier spirit there was there at the time in the 1700s. And so many traces remain. They have a small historical society up there that's done wonders. There's a museum called the McCoy House that anybody with a love of history, especially colonial history, should definitely make the trip. There's also a model of Fort Granville, the fort that burned. There are lots of events that are held by the Visitors Bureau and by the Historical Society, including the big one, of course, is Goose Day, Pennsylvania German holiday. Every September 29th, they turn it into at least 2 weeks of festivities. Check it out. They get a lot of tourists coming in to eat goose for good luck that day and wealth.
What I really love about Dorcas's story is that many times when we look back to that era, I mean, 1700s into the Revolutionary War, all we hear are stories about the men. And now we have somebody from Pennsylvania, somebody from small town Pennsylvania, who's almost a local legend, coming out that she did live to 90. She did birth maybe a dozen children, and she fought, and then she came back. So I really, really enjoyed learning about Dorcas today.
I was just happy to elevate Dorcas a little bit. Everybody should know about her. I'm putting her up there with Johnny Appleseed. You know, I just think she's just a phenomenal person. And one question still hangs, and I'm going to burrow into this pretty heavily.
Okay, go ahead.
Supposedly, 1794, Whiskey Rebellion.
Yes.
George Washington famously spends a big chunk of time in Carlisle that fall, mustering troops to go put down the rebellion over whiskey taxes. Family lore says that Dorcas met with George Washington. I like to think that might have happened. I mean, this woman would have been a legend in her own time at that point. She would have been in her 80s. Records show that he did meet with her son, Arthur, who was a pretty prominent politician at the time, too, on Walnut Bottom Road. You can track it down that closely. But I want to find out if that's true. And again, revisiting other locations, French and Indian War. We're sitting here. We're about 2 hours away from Fort Necessity, a must go if you love history at all. And even more so, I was so taken with Jumonville Glen. Anybody that watched the Young Washington movie that just came out, there's a scene where Washington reputedly ignites the French and Indian War when he's on a reconnaissance in Fayette County. You go to that state park, you go down into the Glen, and you feel like you're back in time. It's just chilling. There are so many ways to experience that vital past today.
And you almost wonder, too, why Dorcas? I mean, why would she meet with George Washington? Or why would she meet with these historic figures? What was she like back then to have met with these significant historical figures?
One clue we have, 1735, she loses her first husband, Henry, who, by the way, just disappears.
Oh.
He's either, the couple scenarios. Either he was killed on a hunting trip, he was traveling back to England to claim inheritance, or maybe he just got tired of frontier life and up and leaves. So, loses her husband, Henry, loses a son at childbirth that same year, but also there are records in the state archives that talk about a court proceeding in Lancaster where Dorcas is arrested for assaulting a neighbor. The testimony, and there's not much of it, but you can glean some from it, says that she was defending his wife who he was abusing, and she was reacting to this. Dorcas gets away with a slap on the wrist, pays a small fine. The neighbor is... the judge is telling the neighbor, you must behave and be nice to your wife from here on out. But to me, that little glimmer of Dorcas's personality show what a strong, feisty, passionate woman that we were dealing with here. And I think that's what got her through. Yeah. All 93 of her years.
Yeah, I mean, because women in the 1700s aren't always painted that way. And it's so refreshing to hear that she was, very charismatic. So just a final question for you, and bringing it back to the 250th anniversary, what do you hope people take away from remembering Dorcas Buchanan and her place in Pennsylvania's story?
That's a great question, Sydney. I think it really boils down to, I just walked away with such a renewed understanding of just how incredibly brave, resourceful, courageous these folks were that settled the country. And I mean, imagine Dorcas out there with 6 or 7 kids in tow, either canoeing up the Juniata or walking over a mountain range that took 3 days to get from Carlisle to Lewistown. Her husband knew the wilderness. He'd been trapping there for years. She didn't know what she was getting into. Imagine how scary that must have been. But that ability to persevere despite the challenge is what's helped make the country.
Cate, thank you so much for joining us today and helping uncover the story of Dorcas Buchanan's remarkable life.
Thank you, Sydney.
Dorcas's story is a powerful reminder that there is still so much history waiting to be uncovered, including the stories of the remarkable individuals and families who built communities, faced uncertainties, and persevered on the Pennsylvania frontier. It is exciting to think about what else remains to be discovered and whose stories are still waiting to be told. As we continue celebrating America's 250th, we look forward to sharing even more of the stories that have shaped Pennsylvania and our nation. Thank you to everyone listening. Be sure to follow America 250PA and visit america250pa.org/podcasts for upcoming episodes. Stay curious and stay PA proud.
Hi, everyone. I'm Cassandra Coleman, Executive Director of America 250PA. Thank you so much for listening to today's podcast. We encourage you to learn more about America 250PA and send us your podcast ideas at america250pa.org.
This has been the America 250PA Start Here, America Did podcast, produced by Commonwealth Media Services. Stay tuned for more epic Pennsylvania stories at america250pa.org.